Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Dare Game, the Irish Garda Files Book 1 by Melinda Colt, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. There were shades to murder only a seasoned cop would catch, a skill not easily learned and impossible for the faint of heart to deal with. Detective Inspector John O'Sullivan examined the crime scene with dispassionate eyes. During the 20 years he'd been working his way up the command ladder of An Garda Síochána, Ireland's police force, he disciplined himself to give that impression. Nothing could be farther from the truth. In John's opinion, the moment you stopped caring, you should surrender your badge. The victim is Maureen McKenna, age 48. She was a doctor. O'Sullivan nodded. The young Garda who'd first responded to the crime looked quite green, literally and figuratively. It was probably the first murder this young police officer was attending up close. For some cops, looking down at dead bodies didn't become any easier with time. Her husband found her when he arrived home from work. The rookie guard continued his report. He called the ambulance first, and they contacted us. They claimed the man was incoherent and in shock, but he did manage to tell them his wife had been shot. Bloody hell, John cursed. It was never easy when family found the victim. Did he touch the body? Where is he now? He's outside in the ambulance. The poor fellow was downright banjaxed, sir. They've sedated him. He admitted to touching her face, taking her hand. Her blood's all over him, so he probably pulled her into his arms. As I said, he's in shock and doesn't remember the sequence of events too clearly. Thanks. I'll talk to him soon. Did you call the technical bureau? He asked, referring to the team of crime scene forensic officers. Yes, sir. Good lad. Go and tell the ambulance to stand by. With a soft rustle of his disposable protective gear, John knelt beside the body, struggling to bottle up his emotions. Pity and sadness wouldn't do Maureen any good now. Of course, her husband had touched her, hugged her, tried to lift her up in his arms. It's what any man would do if he found the woman he loved with a hole in the middle of her forehead, and another one between her breasts, her clothing and the floor around her drenched in blood. Maureen had been a pretty woman, but the blue eyes that stared unseeingly up at him were already turning milky. For a second, John had a flashback to another pair of beautiful eyes. There hadn't been any blood on Shanna's face, yet her eyes had remained lifeless nonetheless, no matter how much he'd screamed and cried. All he'd wanted was to kill the son of a bitch who'd taken her from him, and he was denied even that. He blinked several times, shaking off the memories, putting them aside for now. He had a job to do. Maybe, this time, he would be able to find closure for the man who'd lost his wife so tragically. Refocusing his attention, he returned to studying the crime scene. It wasn't fear he saw on Maureen's face, but surprise. No one expected to be killed coming home from work on what could have been just an ordinary day. The blood splatter on the bookshelf behind her indicated she'd been shot in this room, collapsed onto her back, and probably died instantly. John leaned closer to inspect the body. Other than the gunshot wounds, he saw no signs of violence or of a struggle, no defensive wounds. Her clothes were intact, and there was no obvious sign of sexual assault, although the medical examiner would have to verify that. It was as if the killer had just walked in and shot her, twice, to make sure she was dead. But who? Why? Those were the million-dollar questions. In John's experience, the most common motives for this kind of murder were passion, money, and revenge. Crimes of passion usually involved rape and or rage. There were no visible signs of either here, but he had to keep the possibility in mind and pursue it. Either Maureen or her husband could have had an affair that had somehow led to this tragic ending. Or had money been the motive? This didn't seem to be the case either. Maureen wore a gold wedding set with an impressive diamond and an expensive-looking watch on her left wrist. If a burglar or thief had come in here to steal something, even if it had just been a specific piece of art, he wouldn't have left Maureen's jewelry behind. Besides, thieves were rarely killers. In fact, they usually avoided weapons because if they were caught and convicted, being armed would add to their penalty. On the other hand, her husband could have arranged this, especially if there were financial issues or an insurance policy to collect. They rarely covered murders, but he needed to check that out. So far he had a lot of questions and no answers yet. Suddenly, John paused in his musings when he noticed something partially hidden under the body's left shoulder. "What the hell is that?" He bent to take a closer look. It was a playing card, an ace of spades. Puzzled, he turned it over, barely touching it with his gloved hand. Although it was stained by fresh blood that had congealed, he saw a symbol handwritten in dark blue ink on the back of the card. It looked like a capital G or a crooked C crossed by two horizontal lines instead of one. He turned to the Garda, who'd returned and stood silently next to the front door. John showed him the card. "Any idea what this is?" "No, sir. The husband said it was lying on his wife's chest when he found her. I assume it fell off the body as he moved her." John studied it again. An unmistakable sense of dread knotted his stomach. This reminded him of a signature or calling card. If that was the case, this murder was personal, and Maureen McKenna was the specific target. So what was this about, then? Envy? Jealousy? Revenge? "You said she was a doctor," he asked the Garda. "That's what her husband said. Did he mention what kind?" "No, sir." Could this be the work of a deranged patient, someone with psychological issues who blamed the doctor for everything that had gone wrong in life? It looked too tidy to be a crime of passion. John put the card down again for the forensic team to analyze, then stood and walked carefully through the house. Everything was neat and well kept except for the body on the bloody floor in the living room. The bookshelves were loaded with books, knickknacks, and memorabilia. Several painting-sized framed photos adorned the walls, portraying a happy Marine, a smiling man John assumed was her husband, and two boys who had inherited their mother's red hair. The photos spanned the years from the time the boys were babies until the most recent ones, indicating they were now in their late teens or early 20s. Telling those two young men their mother had been murdered was going to be heartbreaking. When they demanded to know who had committed this atrocity and why, John would have no answers. Not yet, but by God, he would get them. Flexing his fingers, he turned to the officer once more. "Any signs of forced entry?" "No, sir. I checked all the doors and windows. There's no alarm system or security camera. This is supposed to be one of Dublin's safest neighborhoods. It appears she opened the door and invited the killer in." John nodded thoughtfully. "Have you spoken to any of the neighbors? Did anyone see anything suspicious or hear the gunshots?" "No, sir. Most were just arriving home from work. I've only talked to the family next door, but they said they didn't hear anything unusual prior to the arrival of the ambulance. When they saw the lights, they ran over here to see what the fuss was. They were close friends. They're with the victim's husband now." "Okay, thanks. Either the killer knew no one would be around or he used a silencer." John turned toward the entrance as his partner, Detective Inspector Aidan Connor, rushed in. "Sorry I'm late," Aidan said, sliding on a pair of disposable gloves. "I got stuck in effing traffic. What do we have here?" "I figured as much. We've got a real puzzle," John briefed him, omitting his speculations about the playing card for now. While they were talking, the door opened again and several forensic officers came in. "Hey, Norin, how are you doing?" John greeted the leader of the group. "Hey, yourself." Not one to waste time, Norin bent down to examine the body. "We'll give you guys some space. We'll be outside if you need us," John said, following Aidan out the front door. A while later, Norin joined John and Aidan on the stoop. "You got a nasty one here." Norin Dempsey was a pretty woman in her 40s who resembled a little plump housewife rather than the sharpest crime scene investigator and forensic expert in Dublin. Her blonde hair and rosy cheeks gave her a deceptively harmless appearance, but her keen observation skills were priceless to the Garda and had helped close dozens of cases. Experts in this field were hard to find, and so she was a renowned detective within the Garda Technical Bureau. "So what do you think?" John asked, ignoring the gawkers who had gathered around on the sidewalk. Norin took off her goggles and her lips pursed. "Detective O'Sullivan, we have a murder." "Wow, revelations. The new edition. Give this woman an award." Voice dripping sarcasm, John glanced at his partner. Aidan's eyes crinkled with humor and dimples winked in his cheeks. Droplets of rainwater gleamed in his dark hair. "You can't help but love a woman with this sense of humor," he said, putting a hand around Noirin's shoulders. "You should see her when we assist an autopsy and she starts making cracks about the body." "I've seen her at it," John turned back to Noirin. "The playing card was partially hidden under the body. The husband said it was left on her chest, but it probably slipped off when he tried to lift his wife into his arms." We've bagged and tagged it for you. We'll take a closer look at the lab, but I can tell you this is something new and rather disturbing. Ye might want to show it to Jenna before I get my hands on it. Maybe she's seen this before or knows where to start looking for answers." She handed him the evidence bag. Detective Jenna Darcy was the Garda's secret weapon, a cybercrime expert who could work miracles at a computer. In this day and age, officers like her had become priceless for mostly all police work. Complete Hames, John shook his head. I need you to tell me everything you can about this. What do you have so far? Not much. It's one of the cleanest crime scenes I've ever seen, even though it was compromised by the victim's husband. We'll see what the autopsy shows, but I haven't seen any bruising or defensive wounds. No traces of assault, either. I've collected her electronic devices, phone and laptop, and placed them into evidence. Jenna and her team can have a go at them to see if the victim was active on social media, if someone had threatened or bothered her that way. So far, that playing card is the only unusual piece of evidence we have. Ace of Spades, she mused. The most powerful card in the deck, or so they say. My people are still looking. We'll gather everything we can for ye. Huffing out a breath, John squared his shoulders. Thanks, Norman. I'll go and see what the husband has to say. He walked over to the ambulance. Its lights flashed intermittently, red as Maureen's blood, blue as her eyes. Mr. McKenna sat just inside the doors at the back of the vehicle, his blood-stained hands clenched in his lap, his shirt more red than white. Brian McKenna? The man's head lifted automatically, but it took a few seconds before his vacant eyes focused on John. Yes? I'm Detective John O'Sullivan. I'm very sorry for your loss. I know it's a terrible time for you, but I need to ask you a few questions. Brian covered his face with blood-stained hands and started to weep. Jesus, is she really... Who did this to her? Who killed my wife? That's what we're trying to find out, sir. Can you tell me what happened when you came home today? Brian spoke slowly, his voice distant, as if he was trying to remember events from the long-forgotten past. I got home at about 5:30 or 9, the way I do most days, if I'm not stuck at work. I walked in and called out for Maureen to see if she was home. There was no answer, so I assumed she was still at work. Then I went into the living room and I saw her lying on the floor. There was blood everywhere. He started crying again, his shoulders shaken by uncontrollable sobs. John's jaw tightened. He understood this man's pain, knew what he was going through. Reaching out, he squeezed Brian's arm. It was hard, but for Maureen's sake, he had to dig and push for information. Mr. McKenna, did Maureen have any enemies? Was there anyone who might want to harm her? Brian shook his head, lowering his hands from his face. There was a blood stain on his cheek, another on his forehead, but John didn't wipe them away. He didn't want to distract the man from the questions. The poor fellow was sedated, shocked by grief, struggling to concentrate. Everyone likes Maureen, Brian said, his voice raspy with tears. She's a grand doctor. She always takes a keen interest in all of her patients and volunteers at the clinic for people who can't afford health insurance. She was an amazing person. He pressed his fist to his mouth to suppress another sob. John's heart ached for him, but he had to continue his questioning. The only thing he could do to help this man was find the person who'd made him a widower and had left 2 boys without a mother. When he heard footsteps behind him, he turned to see Aiden walking toward them. Mr. McKenna, this is my partner, Detective Aiden Connor. We'll do everything we can to find out what happened to your wife. Now, are you sure all of her patients were happy with her? What kind of doctor was she? She was a cardiologist. John glanced at a sober-faced Aiden standing beside him. When he cocked an eyebrow, John knew they were thinking the same thing. That's a job with a lot of responsibility. Has she ever lost a patient? John asked. Brian looked at him, his eyes half-glazed. It took a few moments for him to reply. I don't know. All doctors lose patients, don't they? Maureen wasn't a surgeon. She was a consulting physician. If she suspected a serious problem in a patient, she would recommend careful tests and always a second opinion. Did she ever receive any threats, have trouble with anyone, either recently or in the past? Aiden asked. Brian shook his head again. No, she never mentioned anything like that. And she would have told me. She told me everything. John shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Rain wasn't doing his rheumatism-tinged knees any good, but he couldn't afford to think about them now. He continued with his questions. What about her life outside of work? What did she like to do in her free time? Did she have any hobbies? Brian shrugged slightly. She didn't have a lot of free time. Between her job and the hours she spent at the clinic, she was pretty busy. We both are. He didn't seem to realize he was alternating past and present tense. I'm a telecommunications engineer, so my job is just as demanding, but whenever we have a bit of free time, we spend it together. We love just sitting on the couch and watching movies or cooking together. Since both our sons left for college, it's just been the two of us. His voice trailed off, drowned in memories. A door slammed and an ambulance attendant appeared next to them. Excuse me, but I want to take Mr. McKenna's blood pressure again, she said, and proceeded to do just that. 'Tis a very bad shock he had. I believe he blacked out earlier. We'll leave you to it, John said, stepping aside to make room for the woman. One last question for now, Mr. McKenna. Were you at work today, all day? I was. Okay. He would check out McKenna's alibi, but at the moment he didn't want to upset the man any further. Every gut instinct he had told him Bryant hadn't killed his wife. We're very sorry for your loss, John repeated, meaning it. We'll be in touch as soon as we find out more about your wife's murder. I promise you we'll find the killer and make sure he pays. Brian's devastated brown eyes overflowed with tears as he looked up at the two men. How will that bring her back? John lowered his gaze. It was an all-too-common question. The platitudes he could offer seemed phony and empty. The truth was that most of the time he had trouble finding a good answer himself. Always by his side, Aiden answered for him. Unfortunately, it won't. All we can do is find and punish the people who did this terrible thing. While it might be enough in the eyes of the law, we know it's never enough for those who've lost a loved one. But when criminals are brought to justice, it gives the survivors a sense of closure. We're very sorry, Mr. McKenna. Aiden looked at the house and property surrounded by yellow police tape. Is there anywhere you can stay for a few days? Brian didn't seem to understand the question, so John clarified. Your house is a crime scene, and the forensics will be here for a while, looking for evidence. You won't be able to stay there until we've cleared it. Do you have any friends or family you can stay with for a few days? Brian wet his dry lips, then shrugged slightly. I suppose I can stay with Eugen and Tara. They're our next-door neighbors, he said, weakly lifting a hand to point out the couple who stood a few yards away, giving them privacy. That's good. You'll be hearing from us as soon as possible, John promised. He and Aiden turned and started walking toward their police car. It was still drizzling, but the clouds had parted a little to let a frail ray of evening sunlight peek through. Since most people had returned from work, most gawkers had gathered on the sidewalk talking in whispers. John watched them, making mental notes of what he saw in each person's eyes. Curiosity, uneasiness, pity, even fear. He saw a man in a black robe and slippers sliding an arm around his wife's shoulders and pulling her close to him. His gaze reflected gratitude because he wasn't the one sitting in an ambulance covered in his dead wife's blood. What do you think? Aiden jarred him out of his musings, leaning against the car and lighting a cigarette. Looks bad. Don't they all? Yeah, but I have a feeling about this one, mate, and it's not good. John described the playing card to his partner and shared the suspicions he had. Aiden frowned, something he did often, but he also smiled a lot, the deep dimples in his cheeks balancing his expressive face. Most women would call those lines wrinkles, but in Aiden's case they seemed to make him even more attractive to the opposite sex. At 43, he was 2 years older than John, but looked almost a decade younger. What the hell could it mean, John? If I'm not mistaken, it's the killer's business card, John said thoughtfully. Come on. The Garda only spoke to the people next door. Let's ditch these suits and start the door-to-door questioning ourselves. Talking to the victim's neighbors was a monotonous job, but often useful, with the potential of producing a lead that could help solve the case. It was something that had to be done ASAP, and Maureen McKenna's murder demanded a thorough investigation. You take the left side of the street, I'll take the other, John said. If we're incredibly lucky, maybe someone saw or heard something. Right. Aiden exhaled smoke, narrowing his eyes when a wisp of wind blew it back in his face. That kind of luck comes only when you sell your soul to the devil.